Chapter 6. The pilot had thought he recognized Kastner and the anonymous person he was to transport, but he had asked him no questions. The small propeller factory owned by the party's clandestine organization allowed him to make several trial flights every week and to have 2 planes at his disposal. This one would return in a month with a different number, flown by a different pilot. Kastner withdrew his gaze from the marvelously rose-colored ham in the sandwich he was holding and picked up the meteorological bulletin. Poor visibility to 10 kilometers from the field. Hailstorm over the Bohemian mountain range, a very low ceiling, a ground fog in many localities. "Do you get it?" asked the pilot. Kastner was quite aware of the comradeship implied in the smile which animated his restless sparrow face at the prospect of such a journey. Is it true, he wondered, that pilots always resemble some bird? "I was an observer during the war, don't you see?" he said. "Have the airliners left?" "No, the southbound planes have orders not to leave the airdromes." "That's the German planes. What about the Czech?" "They haven't gone out either. Only 1 chance out of 3 of getting through." Again, Kastner gazed at this man of whom he knew nothing except his devotion to the revolution and with whom he was going to risk his life. He had a great capacity for friendship, and yet it stirred him even more deeply to feel that they were united not in their persons but in their common devotion, as if each step towards the machine were bringing him nearer to an austere and powerful friendship of a sort rare on this earth. "If worst comes to worst," said Kastner, "I'd rather crash over the frontier." "Right." They continued to walk towards the plane, squatting on the landing field. How small and flimsy it looked. "We start northward," said the pilot. "In weather like this, we'll be out of sight in 10 minutes. They had reached the machine, a single motor, the gasoline tank very low, a weekend plane. "Have you got a wireless?" asked Kastner. "No." For that matter, he hardly cared. The last stamps on the passports and documents, the parachutes attached. "All set?" "All set." He turned on the ignition, the throttle. The plane took on altitude. Kastner could not even see the trees move, while the plane rose and fell in the headwind with the prolonged pitching of a battleship. Far down below, some scattered clouds and birds in flight, the latter close to the earth, almost pinned to it like the human figures. The smoke of a train, lost to sight in the spacious autumn beneath the vast calm of the afternoon, spread itself over somnolent villages and blended in the distance with the dust haze of the city. Soon there was nothing under the heavy blanket of the sky but scattered flocks of birds poised in almost submarine repose close to the earth. Tree-shaded hamlets suggested a peace far removed from prisons. And yet within this very horizon there was no doubt a concentration camp with the relentless cruelty of children. Men were torturing other men to the last extremity of suffering. Only the memory of the prison darkness enabled Kastner to realize the surrounding immensity. And the portentous landscape vanished every image except those of suffering and cruelty, as if they alone in man were as old as the woods and the plains. But above the plains and the clouds there was the alert face of the pilot. Common experience joined the 2 men like an old and tested friendship. The pilot was there, sharply etched on the increasingly blank background, like the answer of those whose Kastner had saved by destroying their names, like the answer of the shadows to whom he had addressed his speech, and the silent throngs of his comrades who had filled the darkness of the prison seemed to people this region of fog, the immense gray universe inhabited by the obstinate motor, more responsive than a living creature. The plane had risen from 1,000 to 2,000 meters. It was now entering a bank of fog. Beneath Kastner's distraction and inner vigilance, kept listening to the motor, watching for the first rift in the fog through which the earth would again spring forth. He had found only a small-scale map in the fuselage, and the thickness of the clouds made observation impossible. In the midst of the fog, which was now constant, time was disappearing in the strange sleep-like struggle. When they emerged, would he find Germany? or Czechoslovakia or one of those Asiatic landscapes over which he had flown so often, with their scattered imperial ruins abandoned to the wasps, and donkey's ears quivering in the wind from the poppy fields. The compass does not indicate the drift of a plane caught in a headwind. After a long stretch of solid fog where the map barely indicated a group of hills, some vertical snow-covered crests suddenly loomed under a sky which was turning blacker and blacker. The plane, which had reached the altitude of the peaks, had been carried at least 100 kilometers out of its course. Before the immense black cloud, no longer calm and motionless in the distance, but crouching right before them, alive and murderous, Kastner became once more acutely conscious of his infinite smallness. Its edges were advancing towards the plane as if to encircle it, and the immensity, the slowness of the movement made it seem as if what was about to happen was some astronomical fatality rather than a struggle of earthly creatures. The wings nevertheless plunged into the cloud at full speed, and its yellowish and gray periphery of frayed edges like headlands jutting into a mist-covered sea was blotted out in a limitless gray universe, unbounded because it was separate from the earth. The dark wadding of the cloud had slipped under them and tossed them into the domain of the sky, which was closed, banked by the same leaden mass. It suddenly seemed to Kastner that they had been released from gravitation, that they were suspended with their comradeship somewhere among the worlds, caught in the clouds in primitive combat, while the earth and its prison cells, which they would never meet again, continued their course beneath them. The frantic clinging of the tiny mechanical contrivance to the unbridled clouds and the darkness surrounding the fuselage on all sides was growing increasingly unreal, and at the same time all sensations were being submerged beneath the primitive voices of the hurricane. The plane was being lifted by the wind blasts and dropped as on a hard floor. But Kastner would have paid attention to nothing but the dogged motor which was pulling them forward, if he had not heard a sudden sizzling sound. They were in the midst of hail. "Czechoslovakia?" shouted Kastner. Impossible to hear the answer. The metal plane resounded like a drum above the crackling of the hailstones on the windows of the fuselage. They were beginning to sift through the cracks in the cowl into their smarting faces and their eyes. Through flickering eyelids, Kastner could see them stream down along the panes, bounce against the metal grooves, and disappear. If a pane were to break, it would become impossible to steer. And yet it seemed as though the pilot saw nothing, as though he were steering purely by instinct in the midst of the hail. Kastner nevertheless braced the window frame with all his might and held it steady with his right hand. The inscriptions in the cells, the screams, the knocks on the wall, the craving for revenge were with them in the fuselage against the hurricane. Their course was still due south, but the compass was beginning to point east. Left, bellowed Kastner in vain. Left. He could barely hear his own voice. It was almost silenced by the flying hailstones that whipped the plane into spasmodic leaping. With his free arm, he pointed to the left. He saw the pilot push the joystick as if to bank 90 degrees. Immediately, he looked at the compass. The plane was going to the right. The controls no longer responded. Yet it still seemed as if the plane were plunging into the squall with the sureness of a drill. In the midst of the uproar, in spite of the ineffectiveness of the controls, the constancy of the motor still gave the illusion of human domination. All at once, the plane shuddered from end to end and ceased to move forward. The hail and the black fog were unchanged, and the compass, which alone connected them with what had been the earth, was slowly turning towards the right. Then it made a complete turn, 2, 3. In the center of the cyclone, the plane was spinning on its own axis. There. And still the sensation of stability was the same. The motor seemed to be making a frenzied effort to pull them out of the cyclone. This turning dial was more important than all other functions. Like the eye of a paralytic who has lost control of everything but his sight, it seemed to indicate that the plane was alive. Its delicate movement transmitted to them the vast, fabulous life which was shaking them as it shakes trees, and the cosmic fury was refracted with precision on its minute, sensitive surface. The plane continued to spin. The pilot was clutching the joystick, his whole attention riveted to the controls. But his face was no longer the worried sparrow face of a while back. It was a new face with smaller eyes, fuller lips, by no means distorted. Quite as natural, in fact, as the other, not a deformed expression, but a new one. And yet, not surprising, as if the other had implied it, Kastner finally recognized the look of childhood, and it was not the first time, although he first now became conscious of it, that he had seen resolution in a moment of danger superimpose the features of childhood upon a man's face. The pilot jerked the joystick towards him, and the bucking plane swooped vertically. The compass dial jammed into the glass. They were caught from below, turned over like a sperm whale by a tidal wave. Still the same regular beating of the motor, but Kastner's stomach seemed to sink through the seat. Were they climbing or looping? He recovered his breath between 2 new whip cracks from the hail. He noticed with surprise that he was trembling, not his hands, but was still holding the pane, only his left shoulder. He noticed with surprise that he was trembling, not his hands. He was still holding the pane, only his left shoulder. He had barely begun to wonder if the plane was once more horizontal when the pilot pushed the joystick forward and shut off the motor. Kastner was familiar with the maneuver. Let the plane drop, take advantage of the weight of the fall to pierce through the storm and attempt to straighten out the plane close to the ground. The altimeter registered 1850, but he knew that altimeters cannot be altogether relied on. Already 1600, the needle was swinging wildly as the compass dial had done a moment ago. If the mist reached all the way down to the ground, or if the mountains were still beneath them, they would crash. It occurred to Kastner that only the proximity of death entitles one to get sufficiently close to a man to know that childlike look which he had just seen, and that this man too was about to die for him. But at least he would die with him. Since the plane had ceased to be purely passive in the combat, his shoulder had stopped trembling. All his senses were now centered in a manner that was definitely sexual. They were plunging with their whole weight, breathlessly puncturing the sheet-like squalls down through the eternal doomsday fog, violently alive with the ripping sound of the hailstones. 1,000, 950, 920, 900, 870, 850. He could feel his eyes popping from his head, frantically fearing the approach of the mountain. And yet he was at the peak of exaltation. 600, 550, 500, 4, the plane. Not horizontal and straight ahead of him as he had expected, but in the distance and sloping. He hesitated before the unreality of this horizon slanting away at a 45-degree angle. But almost immediately he understood that the plane was dropping diagonally, and already the pilot was attempting to bring it under control. The earth was far away beyond that sea of dingy clouds like wisps of dust and hair, now closing in on them, now clearing away 100 meters beneath the plane. A leaden landscape emerged from its last shreds. Black streaks of hard hills around a pallid lake which branched into tentacles that reached up the valley and reflected with a strange geological calm the low, colorless sky. "Czechoslovakia," shouted Kastner once more. "Don't know." As if half-stunned, the plane seemed to be crawling beneath the storm, barely 50 meters above the crests, then over the purple vineyards in the lake, less calm now than it had seemed at first. The surface of the water rippled in the scudding wind. For the second time, Kastner had the impression that it was his wife who had just been saved. The plane was passing beyond the far shore of the lake, and all that was sacred in man, the conquest of the earth, suddenly rose towards Kastner from the fields and the roads, from the factories and farms, flattened by the distance from the rivers branching into veins over the recaptured plains. The stubborn world of men was alternately exposed and obliterated by the low-flying clouds, the conflict against the earth forever gorged with the dead and now taking on a more and more leaden hue was calling to Kastner in the same tone of inexorable mastery as that of the cyclone which they had passed through, and the determination of his comrades yonder beyond the Carpathians, bent upon its subjugation, rose towards the last russet gleams in the sky with the sacred voice of infinity, with the very rhythm of life and death. He let go the pain that he had been bracing and smiled upon seeing once more the long lifeline in the palm of his hand, and the line which he had made one day ironically with a razor. The lines which marked his destiny had been made not with the stroke of a razor, but with patient and steadfast determination. What was man's freedom but the knowledge and the manipulation of his fate? Upon this earth, where the increasingly numerous lights seemed to rise from the autumn mist that was beginning to melt into the night, upon this earth of prison cells and sacrifices, there had been heroism, there had been holiness, and there would perhaps at last be simple consciousness. The roads, rivers, and scar-like canals were barely visible now in the mist. They were like the gradually effaced network of wrinkles on an immense hand. Kastner had heard that the lines of the hand become obliterated after death. He had looked at the palm of his mother's hand after she died, cherishing this last lingering manifestation of life. Although she was scarcely more than 50, and her face and even the back of her hands had remained young, it was almost an old woman's palm, with its fine, deep lines crisscrossing with infinite intricacy like all destinies. And the image of that hand now seemed to blend with all the lines of the earth, they too becoming obliterated by the mist and the night and assuming the features of fatality. Serenity rose up from the still leaden earth towards the exhausted plain, pursued by the streaming rain as by an echo of the hail and the hurricane which it had left behind. An immense peace seemed to flood the recaptured earth, the fields and the vineyards, the houses, the trees that were perhaps full of sleeping birds. Kastner's gaze met that of the pilot. The latter was smiling sheepishly, like a schoolboy who has just escaped punishment. He had recognized one of the railroad lines and was following it through the last shifts of wind, like a great bumblebee. On the horizon, the lights of Prague were shining.